Great, thanks very much, Maria, and welcome everyone to the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre 2021 Seed Grant Showcase. We're delighted to welcome you all today, and we'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we are zooming in today from Gubbi Gubbi country on the beautiful Sunshine Coast. Pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is a place of age-old ceremony, wisdom and education, and we hope that this rich history and ongoing cultural dynamism will infuse our discussions today. So first of all, we're going to give you a brief overview of the history of the ITRC and the vision that we created before we're going to then hear from some very exciting research that's been done as part of our seed grant program for this year. So, thanks, Maria. So as most of you would be very well aware, the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre has had quite a long history at USC. So it began with the USC Indigenous Studies Research theme, which has been going since 2013. And despite not a huge amount of funding, was very successful in building external funding over 4 years, 3.5 million, had 20 members across 7 schools and many HDR students and research partnerships. Then in 2018, the USC Transcultural and Indigenous Pedagogies Research Group was formed with an internal grant. It had achieved $6.2 million in external funding over 5 years, had 17 members across the 4 schools and 13 HDR students and many research outputs. So it seemed sensible at that point in time to bring the 2 groups together to form the ITRC, and we were formed officially in the year 2020, which of course coincided with COVID. But that didn't stop us from prospering. And so moving on to our vision, the ITRC engages in research that enhances the lives and well-being of First Nations and culturally diverse peoples in Australia and globally, and is committed to respect, partnership and social justice. So I will just hand back to Maria, or did you want me to do the theme?
That's okay, I'll pick it up from me. Sorry, Catherine.
Thanks, Maria.
I thought that was smooth enough. So once we created our vision and we kicked off at the beginning of 2020, it was about then organising the research in the centre around 3 themes. We were very careful in the themes that we selected, in that they were broad enough and that they reflected, I guess, the ongoing ethos that we have, which is about people and partnerships and respect. So the first theme was about building knowledge systems, and as it's got there, building recognition and engagement with Indigenous, Southern, Eastern and other knowledge systems. The second theme sat around the idea of creative cultural practices, and that was about the purpose was to revive, document and extend creative cultural practices through creative forms. And our third theme was about community capacity exchange, being to exchange knowledge and to enhance communities' aspirations, research and practical skills and capabilities. So our themes are a bit different to other research centres, because we wanted to make sure that we stayed true to our ethos, where we were going and what our values were, and making sure that what the work we did was useful and meaningful for end users, and that it actually progressed discussions and improved people's quality of life. So achieving our vision. In our first year, we began or commenced a seed grant program, and we provided a small amount of funding from our budget, and we were looking for, and through a competitive process, 3 research projects to seed that fitted into each theme. So the first theme was about building knowledge systems, and Adrian and Patrick are here with us today to talk through and to provide an update and overview of their project. Also, the second theme is Rachel and Candice. Now, Rachel is with us today as well to talk about working with Kabi Kabi. Our third group are actively working in this area at the moment, and they've got some really exciting stuff happening in Moreton Bay in the next couple of weeks. So we'll be really excited to see their update in 2022. So as in terms of process, I guess we've taken a bit of a leaf out of the book of many conferences at the moment, and we asked the two groups to prepare a video which we will play, and the presenters are here to answer questions or provide further discussion after their videos are played. So on that note, I'm just going to click a few buttons which will enable me to share the sound, and then I'll press play.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Adrian McCallum, and today I'm going to speak with you briefly about the outcomes of research that I was fortunate to progress with Patrick Nunn over about the last 12 months, and that research was kindly supported by USC's Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre. So our research was entitled Walking to K'gari. So of course, none of that research was possible without the support of our Indigenous collaborators. So I'd like to thank the Gubbi Gubbi people, the Butchulla people, the Darrinbal people, and the Wapawara people for enabling us to have access to stories within their communities. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, because it was only from conversations with some of these elders that we were able to piece together the story that I'm about to share with you now. So where did it all start? Well, our proposal essentially, at least in my mind, hinged on Patrick's book, which some of you might have read. It's called The Edge of Memory. And essentially that title suggests that we're moving back through human memory, Indigenous memory, to those vestiges of stories and memories that are still just there. So we're trying to capture what stories have been passed down generation to generation, because of course, far before everything was captured in writing, everything was captured orally. So there are many, many stories and many things that we probably should be far more aware of that are probably disappearing as the oral record is lost. So Patrick's book specifically touched on how sea level rise over the last thousands of years has changed the land upon which we live, and also upon which Indigenous people and their elders live. So if we look at the Australian context, Patrick identified more than 20 sites around Australia where after the last glacial maximum and as sea level rose, then of course areas of Australia that once were land started being swallowed up by the ocean. So Patrick identified alignment there between what happened geologically or physically and the stories that were told by Indigenous people and their elders and were handed down. So there were at least 20 cases here you can see documented around the country where Patrick was able to date those stories by looking at when those actual sea level rise events occurred at these various locations around the country. What you might note here, though, is there's a lack of information in central and southern Queensland. Yes, we've got Moreton and North Stradbroke Islands there, but not much else is apparent up until the Hitchinbrook and Palm Islands, but there's quite a bit of land there. So that was essentially the catalyst for this research, to look at those areas and say, well, I wonder if there's some stories there that we haven't quite taken the time to listen to just yet. So our work focuses on two areas. To the south there, I've circled K'gari, and to the north, the Great Keppel Islands, the Keppel Island group. So they're the two areas that we'll focus on in this brief talk today. So zooming in a bit more, here's the southern end of K'gari, and particularly you can see the Great Sandy Straits, which separate K'gari from the mainland. And there's a multitude of islands filling those straits. And just for context, there's no scale on this map, I apologise, but the width of the Great Sandy Straits in the middle there is about 7 or 8 kilometres from the mainland, where about Scarden Island is, across to K'gari. And if we look at the Keppel group, Curtis Island is quite close to the mainland, to the south there, and to the north, the Keble group generally is somewhat further offshore from Yeppoon, Emu Park, etc. than K'gari is off the mainland. But again, we'll present some stories that suggest that swimming and walking, and perhaps walking only, was once possible from the mainland out to the Keble Islands. So what we did, well, we started as we should with a literature review, desktop analysis of what information was out there. And we did that from USC. And then after that, I was fortunate to take a couple of days to go down to Canberra to look at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. And they have a wonderful archive. So I spent a couple of days there jotting down notes and taking some photographs, some images, etc., to further enrich our story and our findings. But of course, that's just part of the effort. The main thing that we're trying to understand was whether there were some oral histories that describe walking to K'gari and across to the Kebles. So we had some wonderful conversations, both face-to-face in person where possible, and also via email with Gubbi Gubbi elders, Butchulla elders, Wappaburra elders, trying to tease out some of their history, their oral histories that have been passed down over generations that we could learn from today. And then finally, only in the last month or so, dodging COVID lockdowns, etc., I had the opportunity to head north to Hervey Bay and then south via the coast to look at these areas with my own eyes and get a feel for just how it might have once been possible to walk to K'gari, say. Okay, so what did we find? So we'll talk about K'gari initially. So as I said, it was fascinating what we did found and some of the reading that we did. So there's a picture on the right here. I apologise for its clarity. This is from a poor photograph I took at the archives. But Devitt, 1979, in her honours thesis on habitation of K'gari and the mainland by the Butchulla people, suggested that travel from K'gari to the mainland was affected by numerous points. And you can see those on the map here in these solid arrowed lines. Across from the Mary River, down south from Inskip Point, dotted suggesting via canoe. But the point I'd like to highlight is this area in the middle. It's a bit hard to read, I apologise, but there's the town of Boonaroo and there's the town of Maroom, and you can see two crossing points there via specifically the Moonboom Islands. So the Moonboom Islands will come up in future supporting evidence. And if we look briefly at the text too, between Fraser Island and Boonaroo, there's a complex of mudflats and sandbars which can be waded across at low tide. So highly suggestive that yes, Indigenous people did wander across from Maroom, thereabouts, across to K'gari, particularly at low tide, across this series of islands in the middle of the Great Sandy Straits. If we look at another map, no supporting text on this slide. If we look at this map by Green, 1979, now Green was recounting or capturing stories of his grandfather from the early 1900s who had listened to and spent time with Indigenous people, the Butchulla people. And this map, it's obscured again, I apologise, because of the photograph I took down at ITRC, but you can see the Moonboom Islands at the very top of this picture, and the word is cropped off, but just north of Moonboom Islands is the word ford. So Green Elder in the early 1900s recorded that this area to the north of the Moonboom Islands was used as a ford to cross from the mainland to K'gari, and that's in the same location as on the previous map that we saw. So this is pretty exciting, where we're getting historical documentary evidence that suggests that yes, it is expected that perhaps Butchulla people used to walk from the mainland across to K'gari, across those Moonboom Islands or thereabouts. But the story gets better. Okay, when we had the chance to have a discussion with Glenn Miller, who's a Butchulla elder who lives in Maryborough and has spent most of his life in that area, Glenn got back to us via email with stories that he recalls from his elders. And as it says here, they would have walked from near Maroom out to the northern end of Moonboom Island on one low tide, waited essentially till the tide switched to the next low tide. And as he says, I don't believe the main channel dried out completely in those days, and they may have had to wade or swim a short distance. So this is fantastic. We've got oral evidence here from Glenn suggesting that, yes, as the literature suggests, his people used to wander from Maroom, thereabouts, via Moonboom Island, dependent on the tides, to eventually get across to K'gari. And if we look at contemporary charts of the area, It's fascinating. Here's Maroon. Glenn suggests they used to leave just north of Maroon, probably across the bottom of Garden Island here, but you can see the L gutter. You know, this is the 2021 chart, and the L gutter is there. So the L gutter is the place where the tides would meet. So if you were walking across here, then certainly it makes sense that you want to go when the tide is slack, and because the tide from the north and the tide from the south both meet there, then that makes sense that that's a very sensible place to cross with minimal tidal activity across these series of islands to Gari. So a fantastic number of stories that came together in the crossing from the mainland to Gari that substantiate that, yeah, right across about this point, we expect the crossings used to occur. So this is a contemporary photograph, took maybe a month ago. There's no scale on that, I apologise. This is from the site of Maroon, looking across to Gari. The distance across there is about 7 or 8 kilometres. Down to my right, or the right of the picture, is the creek coming out at Maroon, but to the left is Garden Island, and beyond that, out of sight because they're very low, are more and more islands, the Moon Boom Islands, which are the islands that Indigenous Butchulla people could have walked across to get to Gari. And this is pretty much at low tide too, so you can see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the flats to the top left of the picture are almost reaching across to that island. So you can see how quite feasibly this would appear to be a pretty sensible crossing point to get across to Gari from the mainland. Okay, so that ends our brief description of what we found out with regards to Gari. Let's briefly look at the Keppel Islands and the stories of the Wapabara, who are the people of the Keppel Islands. So looking at this map, you can see we've got North Keppel out here, we've got Great Keppel here, and again, some smaller islands in between the Keppels and the mainland, which suggests that, well, you know, maybe in times of lower sea level, there was a chance to walk across that area. So let's see what we found in our research. So Roth, 1898, provides some great literary evidence from a couple of centuries ago now. And he says that following the Indigenous people's involuntary removal from the Keppel Islands, many swam back a distance of at least 12 kilometres. So we've seen the map, and you know, there you have it, evidence from Roth that people at least had the capacity and the knowledge to swim back across that distance from the mainland back to the Keppel Islands. Roth goes on further to describe the practice of log swimming. So I certainly couldn't swim 12 kilometres. Perhaps the Wapabara elders, of course, could, but perhaps they also utilised this log swimming technique, which Roth documents. And he's described it on the right there. The leader of the gang gets into the water, guides the timber with one hand, swims along with the other, and then the next person hangs on to that person, etc. And then away they go as a team. And the beauty of the log being that if everyone gets tired, then there's the chance, of course, to have a rest on the log before you crack on again. So wonderful to see this description from Roth, and this image is from Harry Van Issem's PhD thesis of the Wapabara people, which I'll speak about very shortly. Terrell also, in his work, suggests that a once common Wapabara phrase was, "I am walking in through the water." So this is part of the Wapabara lexicon, and the fact that that exists, at least to my mind, suggests that, well, there were times when they would be walking in and through the water, potentially crossing from the mainland across to the Keppel. So that was terrific to find. And then, as I mentioned, if we look at Dr. Harry Van Issem's PhD thesis, Harry is a Wapabara man. He suggests that there's an ancestral dreaming track involving a series of land as well as water crossings that exist between the Keppels and the mainland. So we didn't get the opportunity to gather first-hand oral evidence from the Wapabara. Unfortunately, we were unable to get up to Rockhampton to speak with Wapabara elders. But I hope you can see, as I and Patrick certainly did, that from the literature that's been collected of stories that do exist, it seems highly probable that either swimming and walking, or perhaps even walking alone, used to occur from the mainland across to the Keppels. So that's in brief what we found. So what do we do with it? What outputs do we generate from this ITRC grant? Well, we're fortunate to have contributed to one academic paper, which is currently with the journal. So Patrick was the lead author on this. I was fortunate to be included as an additional author. And as you can see, we had lots of collaborators, including Glenn Miller, Butchulla Elder, lots of collaborators both in Australia and around the world. And that's a paper titled Human Observations of Late Quaternary Coastal Change, Examples from Australia, Europe and the Pacific Islands. And that's been submitted to a special issue of Quaternary International. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll hear that that has been accepted. No guarantees, of course, but hopefully we'll be getting the stories out to an international audience. Second output, again, both Patrick and I are fortunate to be involved in a future IRC, which is currently under development, led by a lady in the Western Australia. So there's no guarantees again, but this IRC proposal is at a fairly mature stage of development, and the plan is to submit that in the new year. And that would hopefully enable us to be involved in the research of similar stories around Australia over the next couple of years. Finally, I'd like to give a big shout out of thanks again to the ITRC for supporting work that builds on this work that Patrick and I have just done. And what I'm going to do with another lady from USC, plus a colleague from the US, as well as Glenn Miller, Butchulla Elder, is do some more work in the Great Sandy Straits. So just briefly, that work will look at whether there is any submerged archaeological evidence in the Great Sandy Straits. There are midden mounds that have been found on Gari and on the mainland. Stone tools are evidence on some of the Moon Boom Islands. But what's kind of fascinating is that Glenn suggested that once agriculture occurred on the Mary River, a lot more silt occurred and essentially silted up the Great Sandy Straits. So the question is there other buried or submerged archaeological evidence in the Great Sandy Straits that's now buried by silt that we might be able to find using a sub-bottom profiler, which is essentially a depth sounder that we can mount on a small boat, do some laps across the Great Sandy Straits, and we might be able to pick up some evidence of now submerged Indigenous habitation on crossing routes from the mainland across to Gari. So I'm pretty excited about that research. It builds on this current research, which is terrific. The final symbol I've got on that slide is of the Kingfisher Bay Resort, and that's just because we're in discussion with Kingfisher Bay Resort as well. They would like researchers, academics to come and give public briefings or presentations to the public and to the guests of Kingfisher Bay Resort. So I'm hoping by the end of the year, perhaps over the summer, that I'll have the opportunity to go to Kingfisher Bay Resort and share this story, hopefully in more depth, with their guests and with the broader public on what we found about our research into walking to Gari. Okay, look, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your time today. I do appreciate that that was fairly rushed. If you do have any questions, Patrick will be with you for live answering of questions, I understand, later this week. But I'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure Patrick would as well. Our emails are there in the bottom of the slide. So thanks again for your time. Thanks again to our Indigenous collaborators. There's lots of information out there that we are very keen to hear and learn from your stories. So. And again, thanks to the ITRC for your support of what I think is pretty fascinating research, and I appreciate the opportunity to share that with you briefly today. Thank you all for your time. Bye.
So what a fascinating piece of research, just amazing. Well done, both Adrian and Patrick. So I was just going to open it up to the floor. Were there any questions from the audience? Patrick's with us today. If you have any questions, or Patrick may want to talk a little bit more about the project or elaborate on where to next.
I'm happy to say a few things. You know, this is, as Adrian said, it's part of a much broader research project, particularly in Australia. We now have Indigenous stories from, or groups of stories from 26 places all the way around the coast of Australia that recall a time when the ocean surface was lower, when coastlines were further out to sea, and what are today islands offshore, like Gari, were contiguous with the mainland, and people walked between the two. So, you know, more so in Australia than perhaps any other place in the world, we've got stories going back at least 7,000 years, and probably more in many cases, that recall a time when the ocean surface was lower, as it was in the aftermath of the last ice age. So it's terribly exciting research. It's research that's also going on in France and in other parts of the world. The submission to Quaternary International is part of a special issue looking specifically at our understanding of submerged lands, places that people once occupied that are now underwater. So it's part of an international effort as well. And, I'd just like to echo Adrian saying thank you very much to the ITRC for, having faith in us and giving us a bit of seed funding to really get this project off the ground. And Adrian has got a follow-up grant from the ITRC.
Wonderful, thank you. Were there any questions from the audience? All good? You did a good job, I must say, of presenting it. Sorry, Cheryl, did you have a question?
Yes. So the stories that you've collected are more from the more recent, when you think of Aboriginal history, are more from the more recent times and sea levels. Would you say that?
Absolutely. So I always think it's probably likely that Indigenous people have been in Australia for 70,000 years. I think in terms of the sea level stories, the earliest date that we've got for one of those stories is around 13,000 years. And you'll appreciate there's a lot of error within those kinds of estimates, errors of thousands of years. But that's sort of a kind of ballpark estimate. I think probably stories have difficulty surviving more than about 10,000 years. But recent research on Budge Bim, which is an extinct volcano near Melbourne, it's actually shown that there may well be stories that go back to the time of the last eruption, which was 37,000 years or so ago. I think that's a bit of an outlier. It doesn't mean that it's not correct, but we do, I think, in Australia have a compelling case for stories of rising sea levels, stories of volcanic eruptions and meteorite falls going back 7, 8, 9, 10,000 years.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Patrick, just thinking about the current times when we face global warming and again, sea levels rising, what can we learn from these histories, do you think?
That's a really interesting question, Catherine. And I think we can learn a number of things. I mean, the first is that we will survive, just as our ancestors survived, a multi-millennial period of sea level rise. We will survive the current period of sea level rise. We also, I think, have to understand that it's going to be disruptive to the way people live, particularly along the coast, as it was disruptive to our ancestors thousands of years ago. And one of the things that I think we can take, particularly from Indigenous Australian stories or narratives about that time, is that there is little merit in short-term adaptation to a long-term environmental stress like sea level rise. So today we take great comfort, as our ancestors did, from building, seawalls to keep the ocean out, which will work for 5 years or so, and then the ocean rise will go over the top of them, and we'll build a bigger seawall. We do have really good stories from Western Australia, from the Nullarbor Fringe, and also from northeast Queensland, particularly the Great Barrier Reef coast around Cairns, that talk about the ways that people actually tried to stop the ingress of the ocean onto the land at this time. And that's another of the clear messages there.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to our second presentation, which is by Rachel and Candice. I shall share my slides. And I'll just optimize the clip.
Hello, my name's Rachel Dwyer and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the ITRC seed grant project that was funded in 2020 and the project is called Singing Gubbi Gubbi. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the central place that this country and this knowledge has in this project, and that we're working with Gubbi Gubbi people as we build the project and really being guided by the wants and desires of the community. So in addition to myself, as part of the project team, we've been working with Dr. Hopo Chin and Lanso Chin as part of the creative team for the project, but they've really made a lot of the decisions about the direction that the project took. We've also been working with Candice Kruger, who is a songwoman from Yugambeh country down near the Gold Coast and Scenic Rim and out to Moreton and Stradbroke Islands. Candice is the director of the Yugambeh Youth Choir and has quite a lot of experience in language and working with songs and educational resources, and she's also been central to the direction that the project has taken. So the desired outcomes for the project were to develop an understanding of the desires of the Gubbi Gubbi people about embedding these perspectives in school classrooms in the region. So this is a little, it really is a seed project. It's a pilot, it's a test project to see what comes of it, whether there is interest in taking it further as a starting point to engage with community. So the purpose is to develop resources that support teachers, specifically using music, to embed Gubbi Gubbi perspectives in their classrooms using language and song. And I'll show you an example of where that's going in a moment. But the underlying part of the project was to foster and develop strong relationships between education researchers, USC and the Gubbi Gubbi community. So that has really been central to developing those relationships, has been central to the development of the project. So the plans of the activities or activities for the project were initially started with the song Little Koala by Lanso Chin, which we have been developing into a resource package for use in schools. That resource package I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a moment, but it has certainly emerged and grown since we started, following the advice from Uncle Lance and Auntie Hope and the School of Education Indigenous Subcommittee, which has we've spoken about the project with, and they've had lots of thoughts and advice along the way as well. But it has really grown into something that is getting perhaps a little bit large at this point, but we're going to be able to bring it together soon. Another part of the project was, once we have these resources together, to call a community meeting to invite people to come in to discuss the directions that this part of the project is taking, which is really building on this is really the, if you like, the intellectual property or the materials that are created by Lanso Chin. He holds the copyright to this song. We've used some Gubbi Gubbi language in the song, but it's really to put that out to community and say, where next? Is anyone interested in being involved in conversations about what might be some next steps, or to see where it could go from here? The intention is also to hold a workshop with teachers to give them a chance to learn the song, engage with the resources and seek some advice from the project team about how they might be used in their classrooms, and to make sure that they feel really confident about going back into their classrooms and using those resources. So when we talk about Little Koala or Gimme Gullah, this is the song that we've developed. We've created a musical score because that is a resource that music teachers find helpful. We did that with Uncle Lance's permission. He thought that was a good idea if it meant that more people could use it. But we're also including a lyrics sheet there. But when it came to recording the videos, we sort of started with, let's just record a quick introduction. But Uncle Lance had a lot of ideas about the direction the videos could take and what we could do with it. We also spoke to Hope about her paint artwork, Gullah Dreaming, which I should have pointed out on the title slide. Gullah Dreaming has also been gifted to the project. The use of that artwork has been gifted to the project for use with this song. It just happened that Hope had already done a painting of a koala and thought that that would be a nice pairing for the two of them to go together. So we have a video of Hope speaking about the artwork and the techniques that are used. We also, it was suggested that it might be nice to have children singing the song and that they should be Indigenous children and preferably Gubbi Gubbi. So we found some Gubbi Gubbi singers and some Indigenous young people to record the song, which added a whole other layer of complexity to the project, but we think we're nearly there now. So that will be with the a recording of them singing the song. There we also had one of those young people, Mayra, record a pronunciation guide. She is a young Gubbi Gubbi person and was confident to do that, and that's going to be a great resource to add to the collection. The resource pack will also include some text around permissions and protocols so that teachers can take this and understand that they're using it with permission. And any sort of surrounding features that Uncle Lance wants to go along with this song, such as that we acknowledge that that it uses Gubbi Gubbi language. That's really important for teachers to make sure their students understand when they sing this song, they know what language they're singing in and where that comes from. And so we can provide an acknowledgement that is part of the permissions for use of the song. But that teachers can use this confidently, knowing that everybody is happy with what's been shared, and that they can go away and use that in their classrooms without fear that they're perhaps doing something that they shouldn't be with that resource. That print resource will also include a guide to spellings as well as pronunciation, because there are quite a few different spellings of Gullah. It's also pronounced Gula. It's also spelt in the dictionary by Jeannie Bell as Guala, which is very close to koala, of course. So we're going to sort of map that out as well, that there are a few different opinions on spelling and pronunciation. And the final part of that resource will be a video with the backing track and lyrics so that students can sing along in their classrooms. When it comes to the approach of the research, it feels like we've barely made it to the research phase yet, but that's actually been going on the whole time as well. That all of this work is contributing to a collaborative autoethnography, which is in the process of being drafted, particularly focusing on the ways that we've worked together as part of the team, and the different roles we've taken, different approaches to, and really looking at the things that we think have contributed to the project being able to move forward as it has. There is another angle for the research, which is around the teachers' perspectives, and that will happen a bit further down the track. After teachers have participated in the workshop and taken the resource into their classrooms, we're going to come back to them and have a chat with them about how they feel that was received by their schools, by the students, and how it's impacted on their confidence to work in this space. The collaborative autoethnography is something that we've really been thinking about a lot at the moment, and the sort of some of the key points that have come out so far that are shaping that writing is the need to move at the pace of the community. And this is something that I'd experienced before, and sort of had, I guess, got excited about a project and thought, you know, oh, this is going to be great. I just need to get other people on board. And those projects always kind of ground to a halt because people either didn't want to get on board or the ideas were just coming from the wrong places. And so it's really been about working with community and knowing how fast we can move and push things along. So there's been some times where we just needed to let it sit for a while, think about it a little bit more and come back to it and move forward. And that really feeds into this idea of trusting relationships, in that without trust that I was not going to take these materials and just go and do what I wanted with them. That was an important part of them being shared, and it's been an important part of us working together. That Hope has said to me a few times that she knows that she can say anything and tell me what, if there was anything that I was doing that she didn't like, she would just tell me and I would just change it. And so that has meant that she has in some ways trusted me enough that we've been able to move forward. And we're also exploring the concept of, I guess that's related to these, of patience, what I have called serendipity, but we're now sort of looking at a sense of spirituality, and how things are meant to happen when they happen, and things happen for a reason, and sort of looking at the ways that things have moved forward, and connections that have been made that, we're still unpacking this and exploring it, but it's quite an interesting place to be writing, and we think will contribute to really valuable research outputs that come from there. So that's just an update on where we're up to at the moment. Really happy to speak to anyone who might be interested in hearing more about the project or would like to contribute. Then please get in touch with me and I'd love to have a chat with you.
Another fantastic sea grant, and Rachel joins us this afternoon as well. So thanks for that, Rachel. Did you want to start off with, did you have anything extra that you'd like to add to your presentation? Then we can open up to some questions.
I have to say, just like listening to it, it feels like there is so much happening that is barely getting to the point of being able to produce research. Like it does move at a particular pace, and just it's just been kind of part of the project was that, and it has there's definitely been times where we've wanted to move much faster and it just hasn't quite happened that way, but I'm pretty confident at this point that we're working in ways that people are going to be happy with, and that was always a huge risk, was that we'd do something because we didn't have the funds to engage widely with community and find out what everybody thought before starting, that it was about, we're just offering something. This is a small start, and to then share, I put something out that people couldn't possibly get upset about. And that was the sort of the approach to taking that was taken in the project. And I think that's really come from a place of there aren't a lot of people who speak Gubbi, and there are people who feel quite protective of that at this point, and perhaps aren't willing to just hand over language. That there are people who feel sensitive about where this is going, and the sort of the ownership of language and who has the right to speak it, and so it's all really tied up in notions of colonisation and dispossession. And so we've been careful and just taking baby steps in the hope that this is something that people will like, and it's a way to start a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you for that as well. And thanks for those insights, because I think they're very valuable. Particularly, I liked, you know, just talking through that sense, even about that serendipity and moving at the pace with community, and how knowledge, and university paces aren't always the same as that sort of one too. So there's a lot of, I think that's a really important takeaway for people who are new to research.
Can I also just say, I'm so grateful to the IRTC for not like stressing about the fact that the project's not signed off, and because this would be impossible to undertake this kind of research if there was a hard deadline and an acquittal process that required me to go through what I said was going to be done and have done only that and exactly that, and like check off the budget line by line. It hasn't turned out like that, but the seed funding has allowed things to grow, and that's been really, really, I feel really fortunate to be working with people who are happy to see it grow rather than check off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that experience that you're talking about is one for those of you that have done sort of bigger and national grants as well, as the same issue of money being handed out through grant processes that have very quick turnaround times, not realizing that sometimes it can take you up to 12 months just to get ethics. So, and even our colleagues in the other seed grant, that's sort of a space where they've just recently received their ethics approval and are now in a position where they can move forward with it. I know in my experience, I know of grant funding bodies who, you know, became aware of that and then started to be a little bit more lenient around it, not realizing, of course, that how important it is to move at the right pace and to do quality work. And like with yours, you know, what you're creating out of this, I think, is just absolutely fantastic and a wonderful contribution. And the quality and the rigor and what you've done has been fantastic. And as well, the previous presentation, I think Catherine and I know Catherine, both thoroughly delighted to see where these very small bits of pockets of money that we had available have sort of progressed to. Catherine?
Absolutely, yeah. I have a question for you, Rachel. So, you know, around Australia, there are a lot of language revitalisation movements and projects. And I'm just wondering whether you know of any emerging language revitalisation in the Gubbi Gubbi area, or and how you think this will potentially help to sort of be part of that process.
Yeah, so it's there is, I am aware of some people who are within the Gubbi Gubbi community who are working towards some language revitalisation efforts, and there are definitely, like, we've tried to have made a couple of approaches to Lyndon Davis and various other people, but we had also, as I mentioned in the video, Gary Thomas's suggestion was to hold a community meeting and make sure that everybody knows about it, and hope that people will use that opportunity to engage if they want to. And we'll continue to try and connect with other things that are going on. We have been really conscious of different family groups within the Gubbi Gubbi community, because, and it was actually, again, one of those things that just could not have been more perfect in the way it turned out, was that actually one of the a young girl who was brought to as a singer, a vocalist for the recording, this 14-year-old was an impressive young person. She knew all about her history and her family connections, which are from a different family group to Lance and Hope. And Mum was just so excited for their two sisters who sang on their recording, for the girls to have this opportunity. And it has sort of opened a connection to another family group that we hadn't previously had involved. So we're starting to, things are starting to emerge in the way that those things happen. But there are, as is often the way within Aboriginal communities, not everybody gets along. And this is something that Candice had said in her work in Yugambeh country. While she has connections to the different family groups, there are a whole group of, there are a lot of elders who've signed on to her project, who've given their blessing for the project. And they all know that they've done that, and they all know that they talk to her, but they don't talk to each other. And so she's managed to navigate that, and that's very much the approach that we're kind of working with. We're not just trying to make sure that we keep lines of communication open, that we're welcoming and happy to speak to anyone who wants to be involved, but also that this is just a start. We're not, it was deliberately not a traditional song. And that's a problematic word in itself, but not an old song that people might feel that they have a claim to that shouldn't be shared. This is Uncle Lance's song. He wrote it, and he's given permission for it to be shared. We've used about 5 different gubbi words. He wrote the song in English, and that's sort of where we've gone with it as a way to for teachers to just introduce a few different gubbi words as some vocabulary building with Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. So yeah, the intention is to connect with other projects, but we're sort of taking it one step at a time.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Rachel. And, you know, like Maria was saying earlier, I think both of the projects are exemplary in the ways in which they're working so carefully and respectfully with community and being guided by community desires and wants. And, you know, I feel like our research centre is in really good hands when our researchers are, you know, engaging in these kinds of ways, building these links with community.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's a great way to say it, that we are in good hands. And look, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along this afternoon. We're 5 minutes to the hour, which I think is great. We've timed it well. And I'd actually like to thank Rachel and Patrick and Adrian for the great work that they've done. I think we're all very, very impressed with it. And thank you two both for sharing through those sort of honest experiences that have come out of it, because I think there's a lot of value that we can draw from that. And I think, again, as you saw with our vision and our ethos, I think we're still staying true to who we hope to be and who we plan to be. And watch this space. We have our 3rd group, hopefully in the new year. We'll have some exciting material to share with us about Indigenous foods and as we go forward. But look, on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming along, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Maria. See you all later. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Patrick. See you later.